Imagine for a moment that you open your eyes in another time. The air feels different, the light is softer, and the silence of the morning is broken not by the hum of machines, but by the distant sounds of roosters and wooden carts creaking along dirt paths. You are not in the world you know. You are in ancient China. When people today imagine the past, they often picture glorious palaces, legendary emperors, and the beauty of calligraphy or silk. And indeed, those existed. But daily life for most people was far from comfortable and far from easy. If you, with the habits and expectations of modern life, were suddenly transported into this ancient world, you might find that even a single day would be a test of endurance. In this journey, we will explore why surviving just one day in ancient China would be a challenge. Not because the land was unkind or the people were weak. On the contrary, they were resilient, disciplined, and deeply tied to their traditions. The difficulty comes from the immense differences between their world and ours. Differences in food, in work, in health, in law, and even in the way people thought about their place in society. Throughout these chapters, we will walk slowly through a single day in ancient China, hour by hour, from the moment of waking to the stillness of night. We will not rush. Instead, we will linger, observing the small details of daily life. The rough texture of a farmer's bed, the smoke rising from morning fires, the strain of endless labor, the hunger that never seemed to leave, and the rules of a society where every person had a place and stepping outside of it could bring severe punishment. As we explore this imagined day, remember, life in ancient China was not the same for everyone. A wealthy official in a city like Chang'an, the bustling capital of the Tang dynasty, experienced a very different reality than a rice farmer in the countryside. But both lived within the same system of order and tradition. Both carried burdens that we, in modern times, would find heavy. So let us begin. The sun has not yet risen. The air is cool, damp with mist. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the great yellow river flows, carrying silt and life through the land. You are about to wake up in a small village many centuries ago, and soon, you will discover why surviving even this single day would not be easy. The first thing you notice, as your eyes slowly open, is the hardness of the surface beneath you. There is no soft mattress, no gentle pillow. Instead, you rest upon a raised wooden or earthen platform, covered perhaps with straw, reeds, or a thin mat. In the winter, it is cold. In the summer, it is rough and sticky against the skin. The comfort of a modern bed is absent, and your body aches slightly from the uneven surface. You are in a modest home, a one-room dwelling shared with your family. The walls are built of packed earth or simple wooden frames, designed not for luxury, but for survival. The floor beneath your feet is uneven, dusty, perhaps covered in straw to soften the steps. The air smells faintly of smoke from last night's fire, which has long since gone out. In the corner, a few clay jars hold grains or dried vegetables, your household's small store of food. As you sit up, the chill of the morning bites at your skin. Clothing is simple, woven from hemp or rough cotton. It is not soft. It scratches slightly, reminding you that fabric in this time is valuable and not always comfortable. Shoes, if you have them, are made of straw or cloth. The wealthy may wear silk, but silk is far beyond the reach of a farming family. The day begins before the sun is fully risen. There is no alarm clock, but the rhythm of life itself demands early rising. The rooster crows, neighbors stir. Life is dictated by the sun and the seasons, and in the countryside, every moment of daylight must be used. Hunger greets you early. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is simple. A thin porridge made from millet or rice, depending on the region, perhaps with a few pickled vegetables if you are lucky. There is no sugar, no coffee, No tea, at least not for common people in earlier times. Tea, though known, is still a luxury, and not yet the everyday comfort it would later become. The porridge fills the stomach just enough to begin the long hours of labor ahead, but it does not satisfy in the way a modern meal would. Family life is tight. Children, parents, and sometimes grandparents all share the same small space. Privacy is non-existent. The responsibilities of each member are clearly defined. Men will labor in the fields. Women will prepare food, weave cloth, and tend to the home, and children will help wherever they are needed. Life is not about personal choice or ambition. It is about fulfilling one's role to ensure the family survives. Stepping outside, the village comes alive. The narrow pathways are lined with homes similar to yours, each with smoke rising from a central hearth. Chickens scratch in the dirt, pigs grunt nearby, and neighbors exchange brief greetings as they prepare for the day. There is no rush of cars. No distant hum of electricity, only the natural sounds of life. The rhythm of animals, the whispers of people, the crunch of feet on dirt. The world itself feels larger, harsher. There are no paved roads here, only muddy paths that flood with rain and harden under the summer sun. There are no streetlights. Once night comes, only fire will give light. The village depends on cooperation and discipline. Each family knows its place, and tradition guides the structure of life. If you are a farmer, and most people are, you are already thinking of the work ahead. The land does not wait. Rice paddies must be flooded, weeds must be pulled, tools must be sharpened. The emperor may live far away, but his presence is felt even here, in the form of taxes. Part of your harvest will not belong to you. It will be sent to feed the empire, to sustain soldiers and officials. This burden weighs heavily on every family, and even before you have stepped into the field, you know that much of your labor will not benefit you directly. Children begin their duties early. Boys may follow their fathers to the fields, learning the work that will define their lives. Girls may help their mothers with grinding grain, fetching water, or weaving cloth. Education, as we understand it today, is rare. For the vast majority, survival skills are the only lessons taught. The morning air carries the scent of earth, smoke, and labor. You take a deep breath and prepare yourself for the hours to come. Already, you can feel how difficult this day will be. The bed was hard, the food was meager, and the expectations are heavy. And yet, this is only the beginning. The sun rises slowly above the horizon, casting long shadows across the village. The day has begun, and in ancient China, there is no pause, no luxury of rest. Every moment is filled with responsibility, and every responsibility carries weight. For you, a modern visitor, even these first hours seem overwhelming. But for those who lived here, this was simply life. And so, your first lesson becomes clear. In ancient China, survival was not about comfort. It was about endurance, duty, and the acceptance of hardship. To survive the day, you must embrace it fully, yet already. It is evident why someone from the modern world might struggle to last even these first waking hours. The morning light has fully broken through the mist, and now the village is alive with movement. The quiet stillness that existed just before dawn has given way to the rustle of footsteps, the low voices of neighbors exchanging greetings, and the unmistakable rhythm of a community preparing for its daily work. For most people in ancient China, that work revolved around the land. Agriculture was not simply a profession. It was the foundation of survival. The empire itself, vast and enduring, rested on the backs of farmers whose harvests fed not only their families, but also the soldiers, the officials, and the emperor himself. And so, as the sun climbs higher into the sky, you join the steady stream of villagers heading toward the fields. The path is narrow. worn smooth by countless footsteps. Your feet kick up small clouds of dust with each step. Around you, the fields stretch outward plots of millet, wheat, or rice, depending on the region and the season. To modern eyes, the land may look humble, but for those who work it, every furrow and every plant carries immense weight. Tools are simple: wooden plows, hoes, and rakes, many of them worn from years of use. Iron tools exist, but not every household can afford them. Often, the family must rely on what they can craft or repair themselves. A farmer's hands are his greatest tools, calloused and strong. And you quickly learn how different this labor feels from the effortless actions of modern life. Rice farming, in particular, demands a punishing routine. The fields must be flooded, and that means hours spent standing knee-deep in water, bending forward to plant each seedling by hand. The mud is thick, clinging to your legs with every movement, and the sun reflects harshly off the water's surface. Your back aches quickly, unused to the endless stooping. Insects swarm, biting at your skin, and the dampness seeps into your bones. Yet for the farmers around you, this is simply another day, no different from countless others. The work begins early and continues without pause. There are no machines to quicken the process, no relief from the effort. Every stalk, every weed, every furrow must be managed by human hands. And the pressure is immense. A poor harvest means hunger. A failed crop may bring starvation. And even in a good year, a large portion of your yield will not remain with you. Taxes must be paid, often in grain. Officials, far removed from the sweat of the fields, will arrive to collect their due, leaving families with only enough to scrape by. It is here that you feel the true weight of life in ancient China. The empire is vast, and the emperor sits enthroned in a distant palace, but his presence is felt in every furrow of soil. The land is not fully yours, it belongs to the state, and you are permitted to work it in exchange for obedience and taxes. The cycle is relentless, generation after generation, binding families to the soil with an invisible chain. The sounds of the fields are steady and repetitive. The splash of feet in water, the scrape of hoes against earth, the murmurs of farmers calling to one another across the rows. Occasionally, a child laughs as he chases a bird from the grain, or a water buffalo snorts as it pulls a wooden plow. These are the rhythms of life, familiar to all, but exhausting to someone unaccustomed to them. As the hours stretch onward, fatigue sets in. Your back tightens, your shoulders burn, and your hands blister quickly on the rough wooden handles. Sweat soaks your clothing, which sticks uncomfortably to your body. You long for a moment of rest, but rest is a luxury. The sun is still climbing, and every arm must be used. The villagers work with quiet determination, their bodies shaped by years of this routine. To them, the ache is normal. To you, it is overwhelming. Around midday, there is finally a pause. Families gather in the shade of trees or beside the dikes that hold the water in the paddies. The meal is simple, little more than a bowl of cold millet or rice, perhaps with a few pickled vegetables. The taste is plain, and the portion is small. Hunger never fully disappears. It lingers like a constant companion. Yet the farmers eat quickly, silently, knowing that the break will not last long. In this moment, you notice something profound: community. Life is harsh, but it is not lived in isolation. Families work together, neighbors lend hands, and the success of one is often tied to the success of all. A flooded paddy, a broken tool, a sudden illness, any of these could doom a family without the help of others. In a world where survival is uncertain, cooperation is not optional, it is essential. The afternoon brings more labor, and the heat grows oppressive. The sun beats down, relentless, and the dampness of the paddies turns the air heavy. There is no relief, no shade large enough to cover the vast fields. Sweat drips into your eyes, stinging, but you continue forward, planting, pulling, bending. Time loses its shape, measured only by the steady rhythm of your work. Beyond the fields, other forms of labor fill the day as well. Women remain at home, weaving cloth on wooden looms, pounding grain into flour, fetching water from wells or streams. Children gather firewood, watch animals, or help with weaving. Each member of the family contributes, for every task is necessary. The division of roles is strict, and to fail in one's duty risks not only shame, but also survival itself. As the sun begins its descent, exhaustion presses heavily upon you. Your body is sore, your skin burned, your stomach still faintly empty. And yet, the villagers continue, accustomed to these demands. For them, this is not extraordinary effort, it is the pattern of life itself. Evening finally arrives, and with it, the slow return to the village. Tools are cleaned and stored, animals are led back to their pens, and the people move in quiet procession back to their homes. The sky glows with the colors of sunset, beautiful yet distant, for beauty here is always tempered by labor. Back in your dwelling, the day does not end. Food must still be prepared, animals fed, and tasks completed. Dinner is not a feast but another simple meal, filling enough to quiet hunger, yet never abundant. By the time darkness falls, the family gathers briefly before the hearth, speaking softly, perhaps sharing stories or songs. The children fall asleep quickly, their small bodies weary from chores. Adults linger only a little longer, for dawn will come soon, and with it, another day of labor. As you lay down once again on the hard bedding, your muscles ache in ways you did not know they could. Every joint feels heavy, every movement slow. You realize now that the true challenge of surviving in ancient China is not one of danger or violence, but of endurance. To live here is to accept unending toil, the certainty of hunger, and the inevitability of duty. And so, as sleep slowly takes you, you understand why a modern visitor might not last even a single day in this world. The people of ancient China were not weak. They were strong beyond measure. It is we, softened by comfort, who would struggle to endure their ordinary lives. The sun has long since set, and the village lies under the quiet embrace of night. But for the people of ancient China, food and the routines around eating are never far from their minds. After a day of endless labor in the fields, weaving at the loom, or hauling water from distant wells, a single thought drives most families. What will we eat tonight? For modern people, the question of food is often one of choice of flavor, of convenience, of abundance. But in the ancient world, and especially in ancient China, food was not a matter of luxury. It was survival itself, measured out in handfuls of grain and bowls of thin porridge. To step into this world is to step into a life where meals are sparse, simple, and at times uncertain, yet they carry immense weight in shaping daily existence. At the heart of nearly every meal in ancient China was grain. Millet, barley, and later rice formed the pillars of sustenance. The phrase to eat in Chinese was often expressed as to eat rice, even in regions where millet dominated. Grain was not simply food, it was life, currency, and tax all at once. A typical family would harvest millet or wheat in the northern regions, pounding it into flour or boiling it into porridge. In the south, rice dominated. Fields of shimmering green stalks promised the most desired staple. But rice demanded enormous labor, as you have already experienced in the paddies. Once harvested, it had to be husked, pounded, and cooked carefully, often with little more than water and salt. Bread as we know it in the modern sense was rare. Instead, people consumed steamed buns or flat cakes made from wheat or millet flour. These were dense, heavy foods, designed not for taste but for filling the stomach. The labor needed energy, not delicacy, and food served this basic purpose. As you sit with a farming family, you find that the evening meal is modest, a small bowl of rice shared among several family members, perhaps with a thin broth flavored by vegetables, or if fortune allows, a few scraps of meat or fish. The children eat eagerly, each bite precious. Parents often eat last, ensuring their offspring have enough, even if it means going hungry themselves. If grain was the body of the meal, vegetables were its spirit. Gardens provided cabbage, turnips, radishes, beans, onions, and garlic. These crops were hardy, capable of enduring poor soil or harsh weather, and they flavored the otherwise plain bowls of rice or porridge. Cooking methods were simple but clever. A pot suspended over the hearth could hold a watery stew of greens, bean curd, and sometimes wild herbs gathered from the edges of the fields. The flavors were sharp, sometimes bitter, but they kept monotony at bay. Pickling was common cabbage soaked in brine or vinegar could last through the winter, providing both sustenance and a sharp, refreshing taste when fresh produce was unavailable. Soybeans, too, were a vital part of the diet. Crushed and boiled, they could be eaten directly or fermented into sauces and pastes that added saltiness to otherwise bland meals. Bean curd, what we now call tofu, was already present in various forms, soft and filling, a humble yet versatile source of protein. To eat meat in ancient China was to taste luxury. For the majority of farmers, it appeared rarely, perhaps during festivals, weddings, or sacrifices to the ancestors. Pigs were the most common domestic animals, but raising them required resources, and often they were slaughtered only for important occasions. Chicken and duck offered occasional variety, but more often they were kept for their eggs rather than their meat. Fish was more accessible, particularly in regions near rivers and lakes. Small fish could be caught, salted, or dried, stretching their use for weeks at a time. Beef was rare, in part because oxen were essential for plowing fields and thus too valuable to kill casually. To eat beef was, for many, unthinkable. It meant destroying one's livelihood. Sheep and goats were kept in some regions, but again, their meat was reserved for wealthier households. For the noble and elite, however, meat was far more common. In the grand halls of officials and aristocrats, banquets displayed pork, duck, venison, and even exotic animals. To dine in such settings was to see the sharp divide between rich and poor, where the farmer's bowl of millet gruel stood in stark contrast to the noble's table groaning under delicacies. Spices and seasonings as we know them were limited. Salt was the most precious seasoning. So valuable, it was often taxed heavily or controlled by the state. For poor families, salt was used sparingly, just enough to keep the body in balance and add a hint of taste to otherwise bland food. Fermented sauces made from soybeans, fish, or grains were common. They're strong, pungent flavors cutting through the monotony of boiled rice or porridge. Vinegar, too, flavored many dishes, adding sharpness to vegetables or soups. Tea had already begun to spread in certain regions, though in the earliest times it was less a daily beverage and more a medicinal brew, thought to cleanse and refresh the body. To sit with a hot, bitter cup after a meal was a small comfort, a moment of calm amid the hardships of life. In ancient China, eating was not simply about filling the belly. Meals were woven into the very structure of society. To share food was to affirm bonds of family and community. At festivals, food carried ritual weight. Pigs offered to the ancestors, wine poured in libation, rice cakes prepared to mark the turning of the year. Even in the poorest household, a small offering of grain or vegetables might be set aside at the family altar, acknowledging the unseen ancestors who were believed to protect the living. To eat without giving thanks was unthinkable. It risked both shame and misfortune. Social rank, too, was reflected at the table. The farmer ate from simple bowls of clay or wood. The noble dined from lacquered vessels or bronze, with chopsticks carved from fine wood or ivory. The emperor himself feasted with golden utensils, attended by servants who ensured that the meal reflected his divine status. Yet for all the rituals and customs, hunger was never far away. A poor harvest meant months of thin meals, parents sacrificing their portions so that children might survive. Drought, flood, or locust swarms could reduce entire villages to desperation. In such times, people turned to whatever they could find: roots, bark, wild plants. Even clay mixed with grain was sometimes eaten to stretch supplies. Malnutrition left its mark: thin limbs, weak bodies, and lives cut short by the relentless strain of survival. For the elite, famine was distant, an event reported in the petitions of local officials. But for the farmer, hunger was lived and felt in the body each day. It was a reminder that life was fragile, balanced on the edge of every harvest. The structure of meals shaped the rhythm of daily life. A light breakfast, often little more than cold porridge, or a piece of flatbread gave strength for the morning's work. Lunch was brief, eaten in the fields, a handful of grains or vegetables carried from home. Dinner was the main meal, shared with family, a moment of gathering before the long night. There were no late-night snacks, no indulgent feasts. Food was rationed carefully, each meal measured to ensure survival. Every grain mattered, every leaf counted. Waste was unthinkable. It was both shameful and dangerous. If you were fortunate or unfortunate enough to dine with nobles, you would enter a different world. Long tables filled with roasted meats, steamed buns, exotic fruits, and jars of strong rice wine dazzled the senses. Musicians might play softly as dancers entertained between courses. Yet even here, food was not only about pleasure. It was politics. To be invited to a banquet was to be included in power. To refuse food was an insult. Every dish carried meaning, signaling wealth, generosity, and status. But for most, the day always ended humbly. After hours in the fields, after brief meals snatched between tasks, the evening bowl of rice or millet brought a measure of comfort. Families gathered in the dim light of the hearth, speaking softly, children drowsy from exertion. The meal was not abundant, but it was shared. And in that sharing lay the strength of survival. For in ancient China, food was not only the body's nourishment, it was the thread that bound families, villages, and empires together. As you finish your bowl, sitting cross-legged on the packed earth floor, you realize that this simple act, lifting grain to mouth, swallowing slowly, feeling the hunger, eases the same act that countless generations before you performed. It is ordinary, humble, and yet it is the essence of life. When you imagine life in ancient China, you may picture palaces of jade and silk-clad nobles walking beneath lacquered pavilions. And indeed, such things existed. But for the vast majority of people, daily life was defined not by grandeur, but by the simple struggle to stay warm, sheltered, and decently clothed. Stepping into the world of ordinary men and women means stepping into rough-woven fabric, small cramped houses, and possessions so few they could be counted on one hand. Comfort, as we know it today, was scarce. Yet within these limits, people found ways to create order, beauty, and meaning in the rhythm of everyday survival. In the world of ancient China, health was never something to be taken for granted. A cough could signal the beginning of decline. A fever might burn unchecked until the body gave way. And the simplest wound, if infected, could turn into a slow sentence of death. Life was fragile, precariously balanced against nature's whims, human labor, and the limitations of knowledge. To step back into those days is to inhabit a body constantly vulnerable, exposed to diseases we now treat with ease, and to medicines whose power was as uncertain as it was revered. Imagine waking each morning with the aches of toil already settled in your bones. For the farmer, rising before the sun meant returning to fields still wet with dew, where biting insects swarmed and mud clung heavy to the feet. Malaria was a constant danger in the south. carried by unseen mosquitoes that bred in stagnant waters. The chill of northern winds brought its own burden, with lungs often weakened by endless smoke from hearth fires. Respiratory illnesses, coughs, and weakness of the chest were common companions of rural life. For women, health was tied closely to childbirth, which stood as both a blessing and a peril. To bring new life into the world was to risk one's own. Without modern antiseptics, even a minor complication could mean fever, hemorrhage, or death within days. Families prayed to household gods for protection, sought midwives skilled in the art of delivery, and trusted in herbal remedies to ease labor pains. But still, the loss of mothers and infants was frequent, woven into the rhythm of life so deeply that grief became part of the expected cycle. Medicine in ancient China was both practical and philosophical. It was not merely about treating symptoms, but about understanding the interplay of yin and yang, of hot and cold, of the 5 elements believed to shape the body and the world. To the healer, illness was a sign of imbalance, a disharmony between body, spirit, and environment. Treatment meant restoring equilibrium, often through herbs, diet, and rituals as much as through direct physical remedies. The herbal tradition was vast, filled with roots, leaves, minerals, and animal parts gathered from mountains, rivers, and forests. A bitter decoction of wormwood was prescribed for fevers, ginger to warm the stomach, ginseng to restore strength. Some remedies worked through genuine medicinal properties, though their mechanisms were unknown at the time. Others relied on symbolism: the antlers of deer for virility, the shells of turtles for longevity, the bones of tigers for courage. Faith and medicine intertwined, and patients placed trust in both the healer's knowledge and the invisible forces of nature and spirit. Acupuncture and moxibustion offered another path to healing. The healer inserted fine needles at specific points on the body, meant to channel the flow of qi, the vital energy believed to sustain life. Burning dried mugwort near the skin was thought to stimulate warmth and circulation. These practices demanded skill and precision, handed down through apprenticeship, and while their scientific basis was not understood, they offered relief to countless sufferers who otherwise had no recourse. Yet for the ordinary villager, access to skilled physicians was rare. Most relied on local herbalists, midwives, or the wisdom of elders who carried knowledge passed orally across generations. A grandmother's remedy for a persistent cough might be a broth of herbs boiled for hours, while a wound could be treated with poultices of crushed plants bound tightly with cloth. The results were mixed, but in a world without alternatives, even hope was a form of medicine. Diseases could sweep through villages with little warning, leaving devastation behind. Epidemics of plague, smallpox, or cholera were feared as divine punishments or signs of cosmic imbalance. When illness spread, families burned incense, offered sacrifices, and prayed to ancestors for protection. Temples became places of both worship and desperation, where candles flickered before statues while the sick waited anxiously for signs of mercy. In crowded towns, where waste and water mingled, the spread of disease was swift, and death could take whole households within days. To die young was common, and life expectancy for most hovered far below what we know today. Infant mortality was high. Children often did not survive their first winters. A simple cut on a farmer's hand could fester into a fatal infection, while a broken bone might never heal properly, leaving permanent disability. Blindness from untreated eye infections, lameness from childhood illness, and deformities from malnutrition were accepted parts of the human landscape. Strength and survival were admired precisely because they were not guaranteed. The wealthy, of course, had more resources. In cities, physicians might be hired to attend noble families, bringing with them collections of scrolls, medical instruments, and knowledge of the classics of Chinese medicine. Nobles could afford rare herbs, imported tonics, and elaborate treatments. Their homes provided cleaner air, more stable food supplies, and greater protection from the elements. Yet even wealth could not shield entirely from disease. Epidemics did not respect rank, and the silken sheets of a noble's bed could become a shroud as easily as a peasant's straw mat. Health was also bound to ritual and morality. Illness could be seen as a punishment for failing in filial duty, for dishonoring ancestors, or for disrupting harmony. Families sought not only medicine, but also forgiveness, offering sacrifices to gods of health and longevity. Amulets and charms were worn against evil spirits thought to cause sickness. A red thread tied around the wrist of a child, a jade pendant placed on the chest of the frail, these small protections carried deep hope, even if their power lay more in faith than in fact. The fragility of life shaped daily attitudes. People lived with the constant awareness that health could be lost without warning. This awareness fostered both caution and resignation. Laborers worked through pain because there was no choice. To stop working was to starve. Women bore the risks of childbirth again and again because children were the future of the family. The elderly accepted ailments as the natural course of age, valuing endurance over complaint. Life was short, but it was carried forward with perseverance, with the strength of communities that shared burdens and losses together. At night, when the village quieted and only the crickets sang, the sick might lie awake, listening to the rasp of their own breath, uncertain if the morning would come. Families tended to one another with bowls of warm broth, cold cloths on fevered foreheads, whispered prayers in the dark. Death was not distant but near, a familiar shadow that might visit any household. And yet, within that closeness to mortality, there was also a sharper appreciation of survival, of each day lived and each moment endured. The imperial court, with its wealth and scholarship, attempted to catalog knowledge, to bring order to the mysteries of health. Medical texts recorded observations of symptoms, prescriptions of herbs, and theories of the body's balance. These writings were copied, studied, and expanded across centuries, laying foundations that endure in traditional Chinese medicine to this day. But for the common farmer or craftsman, these books were distant echoes, their lives guided more by necessity than theory. A man with a fever wanted relief, not philosophy. A mother with a crying child wanted survival, not cosmic balance. The healer's task was as much to comfort as to cure, to give reassurance in a world where certainty was rare. Even with hardship, there were moments of resilience. A child who survived a fever grew stronger. A mother who lived through childbirth became a pillar of wisdom for her daughters, and an elder who reached 70 years became a figure of awe, a living link to generations past. Health was fragile, but the human spirit endured, finding ways to adapt, to heal, and to carry on. To live in ancient China was to accept the body as vulnerable, fragile, and finite. Illness was a constant companion, and medicine was as much art as science, as much faith as remedy. Yet through herbs, rituals, and resilience, people navigated the uncertainty of their bodies with determination. They knew life could be brief, but within that brevity, they carved meaning, cherished survival, and left behind a legacy of endurance that echoes even now. Food in ancient China was never simply a matter of taste or variety. It was survival, it was status, it was the daily battle against hunger, and at the same time, it was the very foundation of culture and ritual. To imagine life then, you must strip away the certainty of full cupboards and reliable harvests. Every grain of rice mattered. Every meal was a reminder of how close one stood to scarcity or abundance, to life or to famine. For the peasant family, the day began with food, though not in the way we might expect. Breakfast was often nothing more than a thin gruel, rice or millet boiled in water until it became a soupy porridge. If salt was available, it was a blessing. If vegetables or bits of dried meat could be added, it was a feast. This gruel filled the belly enough to face the fields, where energy would be burned in endless labor. There was no sense of luxury in eating. The function of food was to sustain toil. Rice was the jewel of southern China, grown in flooded paddies that shimmered under the sun. But not every family had enough land or the means to grow sufficient rice. In the north, where the land was drier and harsher, millet and wheat were the staples. Steamed buns, coarse flatbreads, and noodles were born from these grains, each carrying its own cultural heritage. A family's diet was dictated by geography, by climate, and by what their land and labor could yield. Vegetables were precious supplements. Cabbage, radish, turnip, bamboo shoots, these were the everyday companions of the farmer's diet. Seasonality ruled the plate. What could be grown or preserved was what was eaten. In summer, cucumbers and melons cooled the body. In winter, dried and pickled vegetables staved off hunger when fields lay barren. Nothing was wasted. Leaves, stems, roots, every part of a plant had a use, whether in soup, stew, or medicinal concoction. Protein was scarce. Meat was a luxury rarely afforded by peasants. A small piece of pork, a chicken slaughtered for festival days, or a handful of fish from rivers and ponds might punctuate the monotony of grains. Eggs were eaten sparingly, often saved for children or the sick. Soybeans filled some of this gap, transformed into tofu, soy sauce, and fermented pastes that flavored otherwise bland meals. Beans became the meat of the poor, rich in protein though lacking the indulgence of flesh. The wealthy, of course, feasted differently. Their tables displayed pork, duck, goose, venison, and fish served in elaborate dishes spiced with ginger, garlic, and fragrant herbs. Banquets became performances of wealth and refinement, where variety mattered as much as quantity. A noble might savor delicacies such as bird's nest soup, shark fin, or even exotic ingredients brought by trade from faraway lands. Food was a language of power, and the difference between what a noble ate and what a farmer ate was as vast as the distance between their worlds. Yet even for the rich, food was never divorced from symbolism. Meals were imbued with meaning. Rice represented fertility and life itself. Fish was associated with surplus and good fortune. Dumplings shaped like ingots carried wishes for wealth. To eat was not only to nourish, but to participate in cycles of tradition, ritual, and cosmic balance. During festivals, food was offered first to ancestors and gods before it touched human lips, a reminder that life was sustained by more than labor alone. Preservation of food was both necessity and art. Without refrigeration, people relied on drying, salting, fermenting, and pickling. Grains could be stored for seasons, but vegetables and meat required ingenuity. Fermented soybeans became sauces that lasted for years, their pungent flavor deepening with time. Salted fish traveled far from coasts to inland villages. Pickled cabbage and radish brightened cold winters. Each method of preservation carried with it centuries of trial and error, transforming survival into tradition. But for every story of nourishment, there were stories of hunger. Famine haunted ancient China as a constant specter. Droughts, floods, locust swarms, and warfare could strip fields bare, leaving whole provinces starving. In such times, families boiled bark from trees, ground wild grasses into flour, or ate clay mixed with water to fill their stomachs. Historical records speak of desperate measures, of parents selling children for grain, of migration in search of food, of entire villages collapsing into silence. Hunger was not only physical, but also social, tearing apart the bonds of family and community. The state recognized the threat famine posed, for hungry people could rebel as quickly as they could wither. Grain storage and redistribution became central duties of emperors and officials. Granaries were built to hold surplus harvests meant to be opened in years of scarcity. Relief efforts varied in effectiveness, often hindered by corruption, but they reflected the understanding that food was stability and the lack of it was chaos. To govern well was to feed the people. Cooking itself was a ritual of transformation. Fire turned raw grain into life-giving sustenance, and the hearth became the heart of the home. Families gathered around clay stoves, steam rising from pots that fed both body and spirit. A simple bowl of rice was not only nourishment but comfort, the daily reminder of endurance. Meals were communal, eaten from shared dishes, reflecting the collective nature of survival. One person's hunger was the hunger of all. One person's satiety was shared in gratitude. Children grew up with the rhythm of food woven into their days. They learned quickly the value of saving, of stretching a small meal to feed many mouths. A child sent into the hills to gather wild herbs or mushrooms knew that what they brought back might determine whether the family went hungry. The discipline of food shaped character, teaching restraint, patience, and respect for the land. Even in times of relative abundance, moderation was prized. Overindulgence was frowned upon, associated with greed or imbalance. The philosophies of Confucianism and Taoism touched even the dining table, urging harmony, simplicity, and mindfulness. To eat well was to eat in balance, not to consume endlessly. Food was tied to health, to morality, to cosmic order. It was never just fuel, but part of the larger web of meaning that bound the individual to family, to society, and to the universe. The taste of survival was not only in the grain itself, but in the memory of hunger. Generations carried stories of famine in their bones, shaping attitudes toward food for centuries. To waste was unthinkable. To share was virtue. The sight of an overflowing bowl of rice was a symbol of peace, while an empty granary echoed with dread. In the collective memory of the people, food was never guaranteed, and so it was always cherished. As night fell, the hearth fire dimmed, and the last bowls were emptied. Families faced tomorrow with both hope and uncertainty. Would the weather favor the crops? Would pests spare the fields? Would stomachs be filled or hollow in the days to come? These questions lived in every household, regardless of wealth. Though their answers varied with fortune, in the fragile balance of sustenance, life unfolded, sometimes sweet, often bitter, always tied to the grain of the earth. To live in ancient China was to live close to hunger, to feel the weight of food as the measure of survival. A bowl of rice was more than a meal, it was life, continuity, and hope against the shadow of famine. Every grain told a story of labor, of resilience, and of the unbreakable bond between human life and the soil that sustained it. Clothing and shelter in ancient China were not merely functional aspects of life. They were silent languages of identity, status, and survival. To live in that world was to be defined by what you wore and the roof under which you rested, as these reflected not only your economic standing, but also the environment, the philosophy, and the traditions that shaped existence. When we imagine ourselves transported into this ancient land, we must first strip away the comfort of modern fabrics, central heating, and private rooms. Instead, we must step into the world of hemp robes, straw sandals, wooden houses, and drafts that chilled the bones in winter nights. For the ordinary farmer, clothing was simple, coarse, and durable. Hemp was the most common fabric, spun into rough cloth that could withstand the rigors of endless labor in fields. Its texture was scratchy, its weight heavy, and its color often unnatural, muted brown or gray. A typical man wore a tunic belted at the waist, trousers that allowed mobility for farming, and a pair of straw sandals woven by hand. Women's clothing followed similar patterns, though often with longer tunics and cloth wraps that doubled as aprons for work. This simplicity was not a choice, but a necessity, dictated by cost and availability. Silk, though invented in China, was far beyond the reach of most people, reserved for the wealthy and the powerful. Seasons dictated how people dressed. In summer, lighter hemp garments provided some relief from the heat, though sweat and dust made them heavy by the day's end. In winter, layers were the only defense against bitter cold. Cotton, which would later become widespread, was not yet common in ancient times. So warmth came from padded clothing filled with plant fibers, animal fur, or simply by layering several hemp garments. Hats of straw shielded faces from sun in the fields, while in winter, head coverings and scarves made from wool or fur were prized if one could obtain them. The body was a battlefield against climate, and clothing was the armor. For the wealthy, attire carried entirely different meanings. Nobles and scholars displayed their status through robes of silk, dyed in brilliant colors that ordinary people could never afford. Yellow, in particular, was a sacred color, reserved exclusively for the emperor, symbolizing the center of the universe and divine authority. To wear yellow without permission was a crime. Other colors, such as deep red, azure, and black, marked rank, occasion, or ritual significance. Clothing was not only fabric, but law, a codified system that reinforced hierarchy. The quality of silk was astonishing. Light, smooth, and luminous, it contrasted starkly with the coarse hemp of peasants. A nobleman might wear a flowing robe with wide sleeves, embroidered with intricate patterns of dragons, clouds, or cranes, each motif chosen for its symbolic meaning. A scholar might prefer more modest silk garments, emphasizing refinement over opulence, yet still far removed from the garb of farmers. Women of the elite wore layered gowns, adorned with sashes and jewelry, their movements graceful, their appearance a reflection of family honor. In the courts of emperors, fashion became a language of politics, with rules dictating the length of sleeves, the height of hats, and the decoration of belts. Clothing for children also carried protective elements, embroidered amulets, tiger-faced hats, or charms sewn into garments to ward off evil spirits and sickness. In a world where mortality rates were high, such symbolic protection was as important as warmth. Shoes told their own stories. Peasants wore straw sandals or simple cloth shoes with soles reinforced by hemp rope. These wore out quickly, requiring constant repair or replacement. The wealthy had access to leather footwear or fine cloth shoes, embroidered with elaborate patterns. In urban centers, cobblers specialized in producing footwear for different classes, reflecting both practicality and aesthetic. To walk in silk shoes was a luxury that most could not. Imagine, as fragile as they were beautiful. Beyond clothing, shelter shaped the rhythms of life. A farmer's house was typically built of wood, mud, and thatch. These dwellings were modest, single-story structures with few rooms. The central space often contained the hearth, which provided both heat and a place to cook. Smoke filled the air, staining walls and ceiling, but it was the heart of the home, around which the family gathered. Floors were often of packed earth, hard and cold underfoot. Furniture was sparse, perhaps a low table, rough benches, straw mats for sleeping, and chests for storage. Privacy was minimal. Families lived close together, sharing both warmth and hardship. In villages, houses clustered together, forming communities bound not only by geography, but by necessity. Walls might be made of round earth, providing insulation against heat and cold. Roofs of thatch or tiles sloped steeply to shed rain. Windows were few and small, for glass was rare, and openings were covered with paper or cloth. At night, darkness was near total. Pierced only by the faint glow of oil lamps or candles, precious commodities often rationed carefully. In contrast, the homes of the wealthy painted a different picture. Aristocratic families lived in compounds with multiple courtyards, surrounded by walls that separated them from the bustle of the outside world. These homes followed principles of symmetry and harmony rooted in Confucian and cosmological ideals. The placement of rooms, doors, and courtyards was deliberate, aligned with beliefs about balance and order. Within these compounds, residents enjoyed larger, brighter rooms, tiled roofs, carved wooden beams, and decorative screens. Privacy was afforded, and comfort was magnified by access to resources, proper furniture, bedding of silk or cotton, and floors paved with stone or wood rather than bare earth. Shelter, like clothing, reflected hierarchy. The emperor lived in palaces of grandeur, surrounded by gardens, lakes, and halls adorned with gold and lacquer. His home was not only a residence, but a symbol of power, designed to impress and to embody the cosmic order. Officials and nobles below him mirrored these patterns on a smaller scale, each household an echo of their rank in the social hierarchy. The distance between a thatched hut and a palace hall was immeasurable, a daily reminder of one's place in the structure of the empire. Seasons dictated shelter as much as they dictated clothing. In summer, heat was oppressive. Farmers relied on open windows, shade from trees, and breezes to cool their homes, though relief was minimal. Wealthier families might construct pavilions designed for summer, retreats with open layouts to maximize airflow. In winter, cold penetrated walls and froze water within cups. Poor families endured by huddling together, layering clothing, and feeding small fires when fuel was available. The wealthy relied on braziers, stoves, and thicker construction to hold back the chill. Climate was an equalizer in discomfort, though privilege softened its bite. The materials of construction were telling. In regions rich in wood, timber-framed homes dominated. In areas where clay was abundant, round earth walls became common. Stone appeared in wealthier homes and urban settings, lending durability and prestige. Roof tiles, particularly the curved ceramic tiles that became iconic of Chinese architecture, were costly but long-lasting, protecting homes for generations. For most, however, shelter was fragile, vulnerable to fire, flood, and decay. Life was precarious, and homes reflected that fragility. Ritual and symbolism infused both clothing and shelter. Just as certain colors or fabrics were reserved for the elite, the arrangement of homes followed principles of feng shui. Seeking harmony between human life and the forces of nature, doors faced auspicious directions. Courtyards opened to light and air. Water features symbolized wealth and vitality. Even in the humblest villages, beliefs about orientation, placement, and the unseen flow of energy guided construction, binding survival to philosophy. Life within these shelters was rhythmic, tied to seasons. In spring, clothing was patched and repaired after the wear of winter. New garments were sometimes made, if resources allowed, to celebrate festivals and mark renewal. Homes were cleaned and refreshed, a ritual that echoed both practicality and spiritual cleansing. In summer, clothing grew lighter, nights were spent near doors or outside to escape heat, and homes buzzed with insects and activity. Autumn was a season of preparation, clothing padded, firewood gathered, roofs repaired. Winter brought confinement indoors, families clustered around fires, garments layered thick, and homes becoming the sole refuge against bitter winds. Yet despite all hardship, both clothing and shelter were infused with beauty. Embroidery adorned even simple garments, adding color and life to coarse fabric. Paper cuttings decorated windows, charms hung from doorways, and patterns carved into beams lent artistry to homes otherwise plain. The human impulse to adorn, to create meaning through beauty, transcended poverty and wealth alike. These small touches lifted existence beyond survival, expressing resilience, hope, and identity. To exist in ancient China was to live within the fabric of one's clothes and the walls of one's shelter, to feel their weight and their limits every day. Clothing guarded the body against climate and marked one's place in society. Shelter protected the family, provided continuity, and rooted people to the land. Together, they defined not only the practical conditions of life, but also the symbolic structures of identity and order. A hemp robe and a thatched roof spoke as clearly as a silk gown and a palace hall. They told the story of who you were, where you belonged, and how you endured. In the rhythm of seasons, life was measured by the mending of garments, the repair of roofs, the lighting of fires, and the layering of clothes. To last even a single day in ancient China was to be shaped by these realities. The texture of hemp against the skin, the chill of winter air seeping through thin walls, the comfort of shared warmth, the pride of a new garment for a festival, all these moments stitched together. The fabric of existence. Without them, survival would have been impossible. Work in ancient China was not an option. It was the very core of survival. From the moment the sun rose until it sank beyond the horizon, life was defined by labor. For most people, particularly the vast majority who lived as farmers, work was endless, repetitive, and harsh. To imagine yourself in that world is to understand that there was no escape from toil, no safety net, no weekend reprieve. Work consumed every season, every day, every waking moment, and shaped the rhythm of life itself. Agriculture was the backbone of society. China's rulers, philosophers, and poets often spoke of the farmer as the foundation of civilization, and yet, the daily reality of agricultural labor was backbreaking. Fields had to be plowed, seeds sown, weeds removed, and crops harvested all by hand, using tools that were simple yet demanding. The wooden plow, sometimes fitted with an iron tip, was drawn by oxen or water buffalo where possible. But in poorer regions, it was often pulled by people themselves. Hands grew blistered, backs bent, and muscles hardened through years of unending work. Seasons dictated the rhythm of labor. In spring, families rose before dawn to prepare the fields. Men broke soil while women and children scattered seeds. By summer, the fight was against weeds, pests, and the relentless sun. Autumn was the most crucial season, the harvest time, when every able body joined in reaping crops. Winter brought no true rest. Though fields lay dormant, tools had to be repaired, clothes patched, roofs mended, and preparations made for the coming year. Work never stopped, it merely changed its face. Rice cultivation, particularly in southern regions, required especially intense labor. Fields were flooded, seedlings transplanted by hand into ankle-deep mud, and water levels carefully managed. The work was grueling, forcing farmers to bend for hours under the sun, their legs caked in mud, their bodies soaked in sweat. Yet rice was life itself, the staple that fed millions, and so the labor was accepted as destiny. In the north, millet and wheat dominated, requiring different techniques but equal persistence. In every region, agriculture demanded coordination, discipline, and cooperation within families and communities. Children were not spared from labor. From a young age, they helped with simple tasks, scaring birds from fields, fetching water, collecting firewood, or tending animals. As they grew, they took on heavier burdens, joining adults in planting and harvesting. Childhood, as we know it today, was brief. Work was both education and survival. To shirk labor meant hunger, not only for oneself, but for the entire family. Women's labor was multifaceted. Beyond helping in the fields, they managed households, prepared food, wove cloth, and raised children. Weaving, in particular, was central. The image of women at the loom was so embedded in culture that it became a symbol of diligence and virtue. Hemp and silk were spun into thread, dyed, and woven into garments. The hum of spinning wheels and the clatter of looms echoed through villages. As women turned raw fibers into essential clothing, it was labor that required patience and skill, adding yet another layer to their endless responsibilities. Work was not only confined to agriculture and weaving. In towns and cities, artisans and craftsmen labored in workshops. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons, carpenters shaped wood into furniture and carts. Potters turned clay into vessels, and masons built homes, temples, and bridges. Each craft demanded years of practice, often passed down through generations. Skills brought some degree of stability, and skilled artisans could earn modest respect. But the work itself remained demanding and physically exhausting. For men conscripted into state projects, labor could be punishing on an entirely different scale. The Chinese state was infamous for its vast construction endeavors, walls, canals, palaces, and roads. The most iconic example, the Great Wall, was built not in a single act but over centuries, requiring countless peasants to leave their homes and toil under brutal conditions. Men hauled stones, dug earth, and erected fortifications in remote, windswept landscapes. Many perished from exhaustion, hunger, or exposure, their bodies buried within the very walls they built. Other state projects, such as canal digging or flood control, were equally relentless. The Yellow River, called both the cradle of civilization and the river of sorrows, demanded constant attention. Floods could devastate entire regions, so the state conscripted peasants to build dikes and manage waterways. Labor on these projects was compulsory, enforced by officials, and often unpaid. For peasants already struggling to survive, such demands could push families to the brink of starvation. To refuse was unthinkable. The power of the state was absolute. Taxes themselves were often paid in labor. The corvée system required peasants to dedicate part of their year to working on state projects, instead of their own fields. This system ensured that the state benefited from a steady supply of manpower, but left families vulnerable, as absence from home meant fields untended and harvests endangered. It was a cruel irony. The very hands that fed the empire were often diverted to build its monuments, sometimes at the cost of their own survival. Work was also deeply tied to philosophy and morality. Confucian teachings emphasized diligence, order, and the value of labor, particularly agricultural labor, as a moral foundation of society. A lazy man was not only a burden, but a moral failure. Farmers were praised as the backbone of the empire, artisans as necessary contributors, while merchants, who profited from the labor of others, were often looked down upon despite their wealth. Labor was not only an economic necessity, but a reflection of virtue, discipline, and one's proper place in the cosmic order. Even leisure was shaped by work. Festivals, though joyous, often marked transitions in the agricultural calendar, planting, harvest, or seasonal change. Rest came only as a pause between labors, never as a permanent escape. Music, storytelling, and games were enjoyed, but always with the awareness that dawn would bring another day of toil. Slaves and convicts faced even harsher realities. Enslaved individuals, often war captives or criminals, were forced into the most grueling labor, with no rights or freedoms. They worked in mines, on construction sites, or as servants in elite households. Conditions were brutal, and lives were short. Punishment for disobedience was swift and severe, and their labor served as a grim reminder to free peasants of what might await them if they fell afoul of law or authority. For women in elite families, work took different forms. While they were spared agricultural labor, they were expected to manage households, supervise servants, and produce fine textiles. Embroidery and weaving remained essential. But for the elite, they became also artistic expressions, judged for their beauty as much as their utility. The labor of elite women was hidden behind walls, but no less demanding in its expectations. Their work was tied to family honor, reputation, and the perpetuation of lineage. The physical toll of labor was immense. Farmers' hands were calloused, their skin darkened by sun, their bodies aged long before their time. Chronic pain from stooping, lifting, and carrying was universal. Malnutrition compounded the strain, leaving many with weakened health. Few lived to old age without scars of labor etched into their bodies. Work defined not only survival, but the very shape of life itself, bending spines and wearing flesh. Yet labor also bound communities together. Harvests required cooperation, neighbors helping neighbors, entire villages turning out to reap fields before weather could ruin crops. Festivals celebrated successful harvests, collective joy emerging from shared toil. Families worked as units, each member contributing to survival. Labor was heavy, but it was also communal, the glue that held society together. At the same time, the fruits of labor were never equal. The peasant who sweated in the field lived on the edge of hunger, while the official who collected taxes benefited from his toil. The artisan who shaped tools remained modest in means, while the merchant who sold them might grow rich. The noble lived in comfort, draped in silk, because thousands labored unseen to produce the food, cloth, and structures that sustained his world. Labor was universal, but its rewards were uneven. To last even a single day in ancient China meant enduring this relentless cycle of work. From dawn to dusk, there was no escape. To rest too long meant falling behind, and to fall behind meant hunger, punishment, or worse. Work consumed life, shaped bodies, defined identities, and wove together the empire itself. Without labor, nothing endured. With it, life remained fragile but possible. It is easy, from the vantage of the modern world, to imagine that a day in ancient China might have offered simplicity or peace. But the truth is harsher. Simplicity was not freedom, it was necessity. Peace was not rest, it was exhaustion at the end of unending toil. The rhythm of life was the rhythm of labor, and to survive was to submit to its demands. Entertainment in ancient China was rare, fleeting, and deeply tied to the rhythms of work and survival. Unlike the modern world, where leisure is often taken for granted, the chance to experience joy or amusement in ancient times was precious and occasional. Yet when it did arrive, whether in the form of a festival, a performance, or a simple game, it carried a weight and intensity that modern entertainments often lack. To understand what it meant to find joy in ancient China, we must see it as a brief pause in a life otherwise dominated by labor, hierarchy, and constant struggle. Festivals were perhaps the most important moments of collective entertainment. Rooted in agriculture and the cycles of the seasons, they marked turning points in the farming calendar, times when people could briefly lay aside tools and burdens to gather in celebration. The Spring Festival, known today as the Lunar New Year, was one of the most significant. Even in ancient times, it was a moment of renewal, a chance to honor ancestors, ward off misfortune, and welcome prosperity. Families prepared special meals, exchanged simple tokens, and lit firecrackers or torches to frighten away evil spirits. Music and dance filled the air, and for a brief time, peasants and nobles alike shared in the joy of beginnings. The Lantern Festival, held on the 15th day of the first lunar month, filled villages and towns with glowing light. Lanterns of all shapes and colors were crafted, often painted with symbols of luck, prosperity, or animals of the zodiac. In cities, great displays were organized, while in villages, children proudly carried lanterns through the night. The glow of hundreds of flickering lights created a spectacle unlike any ordinary evening, transforming darkness into wonder. For people accustomed to nights lit only by oil lamps or the moon, the sight must have seemed magical. Another major celebration was the Mid-Autumn Festival, dedicated to the harvest and the full moon. Families gathered to share food, particularly round cakes that symbolized unity and wholeness. Poetry, music, and storytelling were common, as people marveled at the brightness of the moon and reflected on the passing of time. Such moments combined joy with reflection, binding people together through shared ritual and appreciation of beauty. Other festivals marked more specific agricultural or religious occasions. Rituals to pray for rain, to celebrate harvests, or to honor deities and spirits were central to community life. Shamans and priests led ceremonies, sometimes accompanied by drumming, chanting, and dance. Entertainment was never far from the sacred. To perform rituals was both devotion and spectacle, drawing the community together in awe. Music was at the heart of entertainment. Ancient China developed a rich musical tradition, with instruments ranging from simple bamboo flutes and drums to elaborate zithers and bells. The guqin, a 7-string zither, was associated with scholars and poets, its soft tones evoking refinement and introspection. In contrast, the beating of drums and the clash of cymbals brought energy and excitement to festivals and parades. Music was not only entertainment, but also a bridge between the human and the divine, believed to harmonize society with the cosmos. Dance, too, flourished as both art and amusement. Some dances were solemn, performed in temples to honor ancestors or gods, with precise movements meant to embody cosmic order. Others were more lively, performed at feasts or festivals, with acrobatic leaps, swirling sleeves, and colorful costumes. Professional dancers often entertained nobles and emperors, their performances blending grace, beauty, and rhythm into spectacles that dazzled audiences. For common people, dance was more communal, villagers forming circles, clapping, and moving together in simple but joyous patterns. Storytelling was another cherished form of entertainment. In markets and town squares, storytellers would gather audiences with tales of heroes, spirits, or legendary battles. Using dramatic voices, gestures, and sometimes musical accompaniment, they transported listeners into worlds of adventure and imagination. For people whose lives were bound by labor, these stories offered escape, inspiration, and moral lessons. Some stories grew into epics passed down for generations, laying the foundation for China's vast literary tradition. Theater as we know it emerged later. But even in early dynasties, performances combining music, dance, and drama entertained audiences. Masked performers enacted myths and legends, their costumes elaborate, their gestures exaggerated for dramatic effect. Shadow puppetry, which may have begun in the Han Dynasty, captivated both children and adults. Thin leather figures, illuminated by firelight and manipulated against a screen, told stories in flickering silhouettes. The magic of shadows and movement created a unique art form that continues in Chinese culture. To this day, games and sports provided simpler forms of amusement. Children played with toys carved from wood, spun tops, or flew kites made of bamboo and paper. Adults enjoyed board games like Liubo, a complex game involving dice and patterned boards, popular among elites. Later, games resembling modern chess and Go, known as Weiqi, developed, prized for their combination of strategy and philosophy. These games were not only pastimes, but exercises of the mind, reflecting the Chinese value placed on intellect and discipline. Physical activities also provided entertainment. Wrestling, martial arts, and archery contests were common, often linked to military training, but enjoyed by spectators as displays of skill and strength. Horse riding, polo, and hunting were favored by nobles, who turned practical skills into sport. For peasants, simple competitions who could lift the heaviest weight, or who could run the fastest offered laughter and bragging rights within the community. Food itself became a form of entertainment during festivals and gatherings. While daily meals were plain and utilitarian, special occasions brought indulgence. Banquets in noble courts featured elaborate dishes, fine wines, and delicacies from distant regions, presented with aesthetic flair. Even in villages, festivals meant richer foods than usual: dumplings, roasted meats, or sweets flavored with honey and fruits. To eat beyond necessity was a rare joy, making feasting an integral part of celebration. The rarity of entertainment gave it great meaning. In a life dominated by work and survival, the chance to laugh, sing, or play carried immense value. Joy was not a constant background hum, as it often is today, but a bright flare against the darkness of toil. Festivals brought people together, binding communities through shared happiness. Music lifted spirits, dance released energy, and stories fed imagination. Even the simplest game or song could brighten weary hearts. Yet, entertainment also reflected hierarchy. The emperor and his court enjoyed the most lavish spectacles, grand performances, orchestras of hundreds of musicians, dancers in silken robes, acrobats who defied gravity. Nobles could afford private entertainers, poets, and musicians to grace their halls. In contrast, peasants made do with modest village gatherings, folk songs, and simple games. Joy existed at every level, but the scale and refinement of entertainment depended on wealth and status. Despite these differences, the longing for joy was universal. Whether in the palace or the village square, laughter and song revealed the human need for relief from hardship. Entertainment did not erase the realities of hunger, labor, or hierarchy, but it offered moments of escape, glimpses of beauty, and the comfort of community. To live in ancient China was to endure much, but also to find, however briefly, delight in music, festival, or play. If you were transported to that world, these moments of joy might surprise you. The glow of lanterns in the night, the sound of flutes drifting through the air, the sight of villagers dancing in unison, all would feel both strange and familiar. Yet you would also sense how rare and precious they were, how deeply people cherished them. Entertainment was not casual. It was sacred in its own way, a reminder that even in the harshest times, the human spirit seeks light, laughter, and song. Law in ancient China was not merely a system of rules. It was the very backbone of order in a society where hierarchy and obedience defined life. To live in that world was to exist under constant watchfulness, where family, community, and the state all enforced codes of behavior. Justice was rarely impartial. It bent heavily toward preserving authority, maintaining harmony, and ensuring that every individual knew their place. If you imagine ancient China as a land of philosophy, art, and poetry, you must also imagine it as a world of harsh laws, severe punishments, and the daily fear of stepping out of line. The roots of Chinese law go back to the earliest dynasties, but it was under the Zhou and later the Qin and Han that codified systems began to dominate. Confucian philosophy shaped much of the moral framework, stressing respect for elders, loyalty to rulers, and harmony within society. Yet it was legalism, especially under the Qin dynasty, that gave law its sharpest edge. Legalists believed people were inherently selfish and needed strict rules and harsh punishments to behave. This meant that the law was not an instrument of fairness, but a tool of control. Daily life was full of laws that dictated behavior. Taxes had to be paid, labor owed to the state had to be delivered, and families were expected to remain orderly and obedient. Infractions could range from theft and assault to more subtle crimes, such as disrespecting elders, failing to perform rituals, or even criticizing authority. Some offenses might seem trivial to modern eyes, but in the context of ancient China, they were threats to order. Even failing to bow correctly or neglecting to honor ancestors could invite punishment. Punishments themselves were often brutal. Fines and beatings were common for minor offenses, but as crimes grew more serious, so too did the punishments. Forced labor was a typical penalty. Criminals might be sent to build walls, canals, or roads under harsh conditions. Branding or tattooing could mark someone permanently as a criminal, a living warning to others. For more severe crimes, mutilations such as cutting off a hand or foot were inflicted, leaving scars that carried both physical and social consequences. Execution was a reality for many. Beheading, strangulation, or being cut into were punishments for crimes considered especially heinous, treason, rebellion, or grave acts of violence. Some dynasties employed methods intended not only to kill, but to humiliate, making the punishment a public spectacle. Crowds might gather to witness executions, both as deterrence and as grim entertainment. The message was clear. To defy the law was to defy the ruler himself, and such defiance would be met with merciless force. Collective punishment was another harsh aspect of the system. In many cases, the guilt of one person extended to their entire family. If a man committed treason, his parents, wife, children, and even distant relatives might be executed or enslaved. This doctrine was meant to terrify people into obedience, for disloyalty endangered not only oneself, but everyone connected by blood. In a society where family bonds were sacred, the threat of collective punishment was devastating. At the local level, justice was often in the hands of magistrates. These officials combined the roles of judge, investigator, and administrator. They listened to complaints, interrogated suspects, and delivered sentences. But corruption was common, and many magistrates wielded their authority for personal gain. Bribes could sway outcomes, and connections mattered more than innocence. For peasants who lacked wealth or influence, justice often felt distant and cruel, tilted heavily against them. Torture was not only permitted, but actively used as a tool to extract confessions. The belief was that truth emerged under pressure, so suspects might be beaten, burned, or stretched until they admitted guilt. A confession, once obtained, was powerful evidence even if it was forced. To modern minds, this seems barbaric, but in ancient China, it was considered a practical method of ensuring order. Better to punish too harshly, officials reasoned, than to risk letting chaos spread. Despite this severity, law was not entirely without mercy. Confucian ideals stressed the importance of rehabilitation and moral education. Some punishments aimed not just to hurt, but to correct behavior. Offenders might be lectured by elders, required to perform public apologies, or compelled to make offerings to ancestors. In these cases, the goal was less about retribution and more about restoring harmony. But such leniency was more likely for the well-connected. Peasants and laborers were seldom granted second chances. Social class deeply influenced the experience of justice. Nobles and officials often received lighter punishments for the same crimes. That would see peasants executed. A wealthy landowner could afford to bribe a magistrate or use connections to escape harsh penalties. Meanwhile, a poor farmer accused of stealing grain might face beatings or forced labor with little hope of appeal. Justice, therefore, was not blind but deeply hierarchical, reflecting the rigid order of society itself. Women, too, faced a particular burden under the law. While they were expected to be obedient to fathers, husbands, and sons, transgressions against this order could be punished harshly. Adultery, disobedience, or speaking out against authority could result in beatings, exile, or even execution. At the same time, women were sometimes seen as extensions of their family's honor, meaning their behavior reflected on fathers and husbands. Their bodies and actions were heavily policed, making the law another instrument of control over their lives. There were also laws governing behavior in commerce, trade, and property. Contracts had to be honored, weights and measures kept consistent, and disputes resolved through official channels. Merchants were often viewed with suspicion, their wealth considered unearned compared to the labor of farmers. As a result, laws often placed restrictions on their activities, ensuring they remained under the watchful eye of the state. Military law was especially severe. Soldiers who deserted, disobeyed orders, or showed cowardice could be executed on the spot. Commanders who failed in battle might face not only personal punishment, but disgrace to their entire families. In this way, discipline was enforced not just by the promise of reward, but by the constant shadow of terror. Even religious and spiritual life intersected with the law. Rituals had to be performed correctly, temples maintained, and sacrifices offered. Neglecting such duties could bring accusations of impiety, which in turn could lead to punishment. Since harmony with the heavens was considered essential to the well-being of the state, religious offenses were treated as social dangers. A failed ritual was not merely a personal failing, but a threat to the stability of the kingdom. For ordinary people, the presence of law was suffocating. Every action carried risk. A careless word, an unpaid tax, a broken rule could spiral into disaster. The fear of punishment was constant, shaping behavior even in private moments. To live in ancient China was to walk a narrow path with the threat of pain, shame, or death lurking at every misstep. And yet, people adapted. Just as they endured hunger, hard labor, and hierarchy, they learned to navigate the legal system. Families whispered warnings to children, teaching them to bow low, speak carefully, and obey without question. Communities enforced discipline among themselves, often reporting transgressors before the state could intervene. Law became not just an external force, but an internalized code of survival. If you were transported to that time, you would find the law terrifying. The idea of being punished for a careless act, of watching family members suffer for your mistake, would weigh heavily on you. The harshness of justice, the ease with which one could fall afoul of authority, would make life feel fragile and precarious. Unlike today, where rights and appeals protect individuals, in ancient China the law was not your shield, but your overseer. Its role was not to protect you, but to remind you, constantly, of your place. To survive in such a system required silence, obedience, and caution. You could not take justice for granted. Instead, you would pray never to face it. And if you did, you would hope that fortune, connections, or mercy might intervene. For without them, the law would crush you without hesitation. The world of ancient China was vast, stretching across fertile river valleys, arid deserts, towering mountains, and endless plains. For those who lived in the heartland, surrounded by the Yellow River and Yangtze River, it was easy to believe that theirs was the center of civilization itself, the Middle Kingdom. Beyond their borders, however, lay lands filled with peoples they called barbarians, foreigners whose ways seemed strange, dangerous, and often threatening. To survive in ancient China as one of these outsiders, or even as a border dweller constantly exposed to them, was to live in a precarious and often perilous position. From the earliest dynasties, China's leaders viewed the world as a series of concentric circles. At the core was the emperor, the son of heaven, whose authority radiated outward. Closest to him were loyal nobles, peasants, and officials who lived within the cultivated zones of the empire. Beyond those fields and walled cities lay the rougher countryside, and beyond that, the wilderness home to peoples who did not follow Chinese customs. These outsiders might be nomads on horseback, traders moving along dangerous roads, or tribes who resisted imperial authority. To the Chinese worldview, they were uncivilized, unruly, and often untrustworthy. One of the most constant threats came from the northern steppes, where nomadic peoples like the Xiongnu roamed. Guild horsemen, they could sweep across the borderlands with terrifying speed, raiding villages, stealing cattle, and burning fields. For sedentary farmers who relied on stability and crops tied to the soil, the mobility of the steppe riders was almost supernatural. They could appear out of nowhere, strike swiftly, and vanish before imperial troops could respond. This constant danger shaped life in northern China, where entire communities lived in fear of the next raid. The response to these threats was monumental. The building of walls, fortifications, and military outposts. The Great Wall, though constructed in stages and rebuilt by different dynasties, was the ultimate symbol of China's effort to protect itself from the barbarians. Soldiers stationed along these walls endured brutal conditions, harsh winters, limited supplies, and constant vigilance. For a farmer conscripted to such duty, it was both punishment and sacrifice. For the empire, It was a statement: civilization within, chaos beyond. But even as the Chinese distrusted the steppe peoples, they also depended on them. Horses, vital for warfare, were often acquired through trade or tribute from nomads. Exotic goods, such as jade, furs, and rare animals, flowed across the borders. Markets sprouted at the edges of the empire, where Chinese merchants and foreign traders exchanged goods under the watchful eye of officials. These encounters were tense, for commerce blurred the line between friend and enemy. To welcome foreigners was to risk infiltration, yet to reject them completely was to deprive the empire of valuable resources. Diplomacy with these groups was equally fraught. Marriage alliances were sometimes arranged, with Chinese princesses given to nomadic leaders in hopes of securing peace. These unions, however, were rarely popular within the empire, where many saw them as humiliating concessions. Yet they highlight the delicate balance of power. Even the mighty Chinese state could not always dominate the so-called barbarians. Instead, it had to negotiate, bribe, or compromise to keep the borders quiet. Life on the frontiers was different from that in the core of the empire. Here, cultures mixed, and Chinese settlers lived alongside foreign tribes. Tension was constant, but so was exchange. Border communities often borrowed customs, foods, and languages from their neighbors, creating hybrid ways of life that confused officials in the capital. To the government, these borderlands seemed unruly, difficult to control, and suspiciously foreign. For those who lived there, however, adaptation was a matter of survival. Foreigners who entered the empire, whether as traders, envoys, or captives, faced a difficult existence. They were often viewed with suspicion, their strange clothes, languages, and religions marking them as outsiders. Some were enslaved, forced into labor, or made curiosities in the courts of nobles. Others were tolerated, but kept at a distance, confined to specific areas, or heavily taxed. For a foreigner, the constant reminder was that they did not belong to the Middle Kingdom. They were guests at best, threats at worst. The Silk Road, which began to flourish during the Han Dynasty, brought waves of foreign contact. From the west came Persians, Indians, and even distant Romans. Caravans carried silk, spices, glassware, and stories of lands far beyond the empire's borders. These arrivals fascinated the Chinese, but also unsettled them. Foreign religions, such as Buddhism, trickled in, carried by monks and merchants. Over time, Buddhism would profoundly reshape Chinese thought, but in its early days, it was treated with skepticism. Strange gods, foreign texts, and unfamiliar rituals challenged the traditional order. To be a Buddhist monk in those early centuries was to live under suspicion, sometimes persecuted, sometimes tolerated, never fully secure. The perception of foreigners as barbarians was not only cultural, but moral. To the Chinese elite, foreigners lacked the refinement of Confucian order. They did not practice proper rituals, respect hierarchies, or honor ancestors. They were loud, undisciplined, and unpredictable. These stereotypes justified harsh treatment, ensuring that foreigners remained outside the boundaries of true belonging. For an outsider trying to integrate, the struggle was immense. They could adopt Chinese dress, learn the language, and bow to authority. But their foreign origins would never fully be forgotten. Prisoners of war represented another category of outsiders. Captured during campaigns, they were often enslaved, forced into military service, or used as laborers. Their lives were harsh and precarious. Seen as both dangerous and useful, they were denied rights and watched carefully. Many perished from exhaustion, hunger, or abuse. Yet some, through loyalty or skill, rose to trusted positions. Their foreign origins turned into tools for the empire. Even then, however, their acceptance was fragile, always conditional. The fear of foreigners was also tied to the cosmic order. The emperor was believed to rule under the mandate of heaven, and disorder on the frontiers was a sign that this harmony was breaking down. A border rebellion or invasion suggested that the ruler had lost divine favor. Thus, foreign threats were not only military concerns, but spiritual warnings. If barbarians crossed the borders, it was not just a political failure, but a cosmic imbalance. People within the empire felt the weight of this belief, fearing that chaos outside might spill into their daily lives, bringing famine, disaster, or rebellion. For those living far from the heartland, loyalty was always questioned. Were they truly Chinese? Or did they secretly sympathize with the outsiders just across the border? Families who lived too close to foreigners were often distrusted, suspected of trading illegally or harboring sympathies for barbarian ways. This suspicion could ruin reputations, destroy livelihoods, or even lead to punishments. Simply being born in the wrong place carried risks that no amount of loyalty could erase. If you were a foreigner or border dweller in ancient China, survival meant constant negotiation. You had to prove your loyalty, often through taxes, labor, or military service. You might be conscripted to fight against your own people, placed in impossible positions where betrayal of one side or the other was inevitable. You lived under the shadow of suspicion, always reminded that you were not fully trusted. And yet, despite these divisions, foreigners and Chinese influenced one another deeply. Foods, technologies, and ideas flowed across borders, often in defiance of official policy. Music from Central Asia delighted nobles, while exotic goods from the West became prized luxuries. Steppe tactics shaped Chinese cavalry, just as Chinese walls shaped steppe strategy. The relationship was never one of complete separation, but of uneasy exchange, where hostility and dependence existed side by side. To imagine yourself in that world is to imagine a life lived in between. If you were Chinese but lived near the edge of the empire, you were forever defending your identity, proving you were civilized and loyal. If you were foreign, you were always fighting for recognition, survival, and dignity. The constant message from the empire was clear. You are lesser, you are dangerous, you are other. To survive, you would bow, adapt, conceal, and compromise. You might wear the clothes of the Chinese, speak their tongue, and follow their rituals, but your foreignness would always linger, a shadow that never faded. For the empire, you were a reminder of the thin line between order and chaos. For yourself, you were a survivor in a world that saw you as something less than human. Religion and ritual were the invisible threads that held the vast tapestry of ancient China together. Though dynasties rose and fell, though emperors claimed power and lost it, the belief that the universe was governed by a delicate balance never disappeared. At the very center of this belief system was the mandate of heaven, a concept that explained why rulers ruled, why empires prospered, and why they eventually collapsed. To live in this world was to live surrounded by rituals that affirmed order, guided morality, and linked the everyday existence of peasants and nobles alike to the will of the cosmos. The mandate of heaven was more than a political theory. It was the very foundation of legitimacy. Unlike divine kingship in Egypt or hereditary rights in medieval Europe, Chinese rulers did not claim to be gods themselves. Instead, they claimed to rule because heaven allowed it. Heaven, or Tian, was not a god in the human sense, but a vast moral force, an order that governed the universe. If a ruler was virtuous, if he cared for his people, maintained harmony, and honored the ancestors, heaven would bless his reign. Crops would grow, rivers would flow calmly, and peace would prevail. But if a ruler became corrupt, cruel, or neglectful, heaven would withdraw its mandate. The signs of this withdrawal were unmistakable: floods, earthquakes, famines, invasions, and rebellion. For ordinary people, this belief was both comforting and terrifying. It meant that their suffering had meaning, that disasters were not random, but messages from the cosmos. A flood was not just a flood, it was heaven announcing that the emperor had failed in his duties. A famine was a sign that the dynasty was weakening. In this way, natural disasters were never only natural, they were political omens. To live in ancient China was to constantly look for signs in the sky, in the earth, and in the changing of the seasons, wondering what heaven was trying to say. Rituals were the means by which this cosmic order was maintained. For the emperor, the most sacred duty was to perform the great rites that linked his reign to the heavens. Each year, the Son of Heaven would travel to temples and altars, offering sacrifices to heaven, earth, the ancestors, and the spirits of mountains and rivers. These ceremonies were grand spectacles filled with music, incense, and solemn prayers. To neglect them was unthinkable, for it risked breaking the fragile bond between heaven and the empire. One of the most important sites was the Temple of Heaven in the capital. Here, the emperor would perform the winter solstice ceremony, kneeling before the heavens and offering sacrifices of jade, silk, and animals. The rituals were precise, for every movement, every word carried cosmic weight. If he performed them correctly, the realm would be blessed. If he erred, disaster could follow. Even the emperor, surrounded by palaces and armies, lived under this heavy burden. But ritual was not confined to emperors. Every household in China, from the grand mansions of nobles to the humble huts of peasants, was shaped by ritual. Ancestor worship was at the heart of daily life. Families kept ancestral tablets, small wooden or stone objects inscribed with the names of the dead. These were placed on altars where food, incense, and prayers were offered. To neglect one's ancestors was to risk their anger, for the dead were believed to watch over the living. They could bless a family with health and prosperity, or curse them with illness and misfortune. This constant honoring of ancestors created an unbroken chain between past and present. A child bowing before an ancestral tablet was not just respecting their parents or grandparents, they were affirming their place in a lineage that stretched back for centuries. The idea of the individual was less important than the family, and the family less important than the harmony of society as a whole. In this way, ritual preserved the order of both heaven and earth. Confucianism, which emerged during the turbulent spring and autumn period, gave this ritual life a powerful framework. Confucius taught that harmony could only be maintained through proper conduct, respect for hierarchy, and devotion to ritual. The smallest gestures, bowing correctly, speaking with humility, honoring elders were not mere customs, but acts that aligned humanity with the cosmic order. To be filial to one's parents was to mirror the loyalty of subjects to the emperor. To be respectful in ritual was to help maintain the balance between heaven and earth. But Confucianism was not the only spiritual force in China. Taoism offered a very different vision. Where Confucius emphasized order, rules, and ritual, Taoism sought harmony through simplicity and naturalness. The Tao, the way, was the great current that flowed through all things. To live well was to align oneself with the Tao, to embrace stillness, spontaneity, and the cycles of nature. Taoist rituals involve meditation, breathing practices, and the use of talismans to ward off evil. In remote mountains, Taoist sages sought immortality, experimenting with elixirs and alchemy, hoping to transcend the limits of the human body. For ordinary people, Taoism offered comfort against the uncertainties of life. Where Confucianism demanded discipline, Taoism allowed retreat. A farmer exhausted by taxes and labor might turn to Taoist charms to protect his family from illness. A woman fearing childbirth might pray to Taoist deities for safe delivery. Where Confucianism governed society, Taoism seeped into daily life, offering small, practical ways to deal with fear and suffering. Buddhism arrived later, carried by merchants and monks along the Silk Road. At first, it was seen as a foreign curiosity, its strange statues and teachings alien to Chinese traditions. But over time, Buddhism spread, adapting to Chinese culture and winning converts. Its promise of escape from suffering, of rebirth into better lives, and of ultimate enlightenment appealed deeply to those crushed by poverty or grief. Monasteries sprouted across the land, offering food, shelter, and education. For peasants, these monasteries were havens in times of famine or war. For nobles, they were centers of learning and patronage. The presence of Buddhism reshaped the religious landscape. Temples filled with chanting monks, the smell of incense drifting through mountain valleys. The ringing of bells at dawn became part of the Chinese experience. Yet Buddhism also provoked suspicion. Its celibate monks rejected family life, which clashed with Confucian values of filial duty. Its foreign origins made some officials wary, especially during times of instability. When foreign ideas were seen as threats, waves of persecution periodically struck monasteries, with temples burned and scriptures destroyed. Still, Buddhism endured, embedding itself deeply in Chinese culture. Religion in ancient China was never about one single belief system. Instead, it was a weaving together of many strands: Confucian discipline, Taoist mysticism, Buddhist compassion, and the deep-rooted practices of ancestor worship and folk ritual. A single person might honor their ancestors at home, consult a Taoist priest for protection, and visit a Buddhist temple for blessings. These traditions overlapped, conflicted, and blended, creating a rich spiritual tapestry. For those living within this system, survival meant more than food and shelter. It meant maintaining harmony with forces beyond human control. A farmer prayed not only for rain, but for the emperor to remain virtuous, so heaven would bless the crops. A mother lit incense for her ancestors, believing their favor would shield her children. A soldier marching to the frontier carried amulets against demons, trusting ritual to protect him where weapons could not. Ritual also reinforced the hierarchy of society. Each class had its place, each role its duties. A nobleman's ritual was grand, with elaborate sacrifices and ornate shrines. A peasant's was humble, with bowls of rice left on a simple wooden altar. Yet both were bound by the same cosmic logic. To neglect ritual, no matter how small, was to risk disorder. In this way, ritual was a form of discipline, a constant reminder that the individual was never alone, but part of a vast network of ancestors, spirits, and cosmic forces. Festivals marked the rhythm of the year, combining religion with community life. The Spring Festival, the ancestor rites of King Ming, the Mid-Autumn Festival all carried religious weight. Lanterns, dragon dances, offerings of food, the burning of incense and paper money, these were not mere celebrations, but acts of alignment with heaven and earth. For a peasant, these festivals were both moments of joy and solemn duty, ensuring that the coming year would be blessed. To question the rituals was dangerous. Skepticism could be seen as rebellion, for if you doubted the mandate of heaven, you doubted the emperor himself. To neglect your ancestors was to shame your family and risk social ostracism. Even emperors were judged by their ritual behavior. A ruler who failed to perform sacrifices, or who indulged in excess instead of solemn duty, invited whispers that heaven's mandate was slipping away. The people would watch carefully. Did floods increase? Did rebels rise? Did the stars themselves seem unsettled? These were signs that the cosmic balance was broken. To imagine yourself in this world is to imagine a life where every act carried cosmic weight. To sweep the floor was not only to clean, but to drive away bad spirits. To bow before your parents was not only respect, but a reaffirmation of the entire social order. To hear thunder was not only to hear weather, but to listen for the voice of heaven itself. And always, behind it all, the mandate of heaven loomed. It was the ultimate measure of rulers and the final explanation for suffering. If the dynasty fell, it was not because armies were stronger or plots more cunning, it was because heaven had decided it was time. To live in ancient China was to live with the certainty that human fate was woven into the will of heaven, that the emperor's virtue or corruption echoed in the wind, the rain, and the trembling of the earth. For the common person, this meant both hope and helplessness. Hope because a just ruler would bring harmony and prosperity. Helplessness because if heaven withdrew its favor, nothing could stop the tide of famine, war, and collapse. In this way, the mandate of heaven bound every life to the vast cycles of history, making peasants and emperors alike participants in the great drama of cosmic order. To survive in this system, you obeyed, you honored, you performed the rites. You whispered prayers to ancestors, lit incense in temples, bowed before heaven's will. You might never see the emperor, but his rituals determined your fate. You might never understand the teachings of Confucius, Lao Tzu, or the Buddha, but their ideas shaped the world around you. Religion was not a choice. It was the air you breathed, the rhythm of your days, the meaning behind joy and suffering alike. To reach the end of this journey through ancient China is to realize that survival in that world was never guaranteed, and that for most people, life was a delicate balance between endurance and hope. We have walked through the daily hardships of peasants, the crushing demands of labor, the strict laws of emperors, the iron grip of hierarchy, the invisible weight of ancestors and heaven itself. And at every step, one truth becomes clear. To live even a single day in this world was a challenge that most of us, shaped by modern comforts and freedoms, would not withstand. Imagine waking not to the hum of machines or the glow of electricity, but to the crow of a rooster, and the urgent demands of work that would consume you from dawn to dusk. There was no weekend, no reprieve, no promise of leisure. A farmer bent over the rice fields was locked in a cycle dictated by the seasons, by rain and drought, by the tax collector who arrived no matter the yield. Hunger was not an occasional inconvenience, but a constant shadow. Even in good years, the meals were simple and repetitive. In bad years, they dwindled to husks and weeds. Illness lurked in every corner, untempered by modern medicine, and the fate of a family could turn overnight from security to despair. Beyond survival, there was fear. The fear of punishment was ever present, for the law was not a shield, but a weapon in the hands of rulers determined to maintain order. A careless word, a theft born of hunger, or a whisper of dissent could end in torture, mutilation, or death. Punishment was not only retribution, but a performance, a way of teaching obedience through terror. To walk the streets of a city was to pass by execution grounds, to hear the warnings carried in the cries of the condemned. This was not a justice system designed to protect, but to control. And yet, for all its harshness, this society endured for millennia. The very systems that seem unbearable to us, the rigid hierarchies, the suffocating rituals, the submission to family and emperor alike were the glue that held it together. Where we might see oppression, many in that world saw stability. To honor ancestors, to bow before parents, to obey the emperor, these were not just burdens, but acts that gave meaning and order to existence. Life was hard, but it was not meaningless. It was part of a cosmic pattern, woven into the will of heaven itself. The mandate of heaven offered both explanation and consolation. When disasters struck, they were not senseless tragedies, but messages from the cosmos. When dynasties fell, it was not only human ambition or failure, but heaven shifting its favor. This belief gave people a way to endure, to see their suffering not as chaos, but as part of the grand cycle of history. It also meant that emperors, for all their power, were never untouchable. They too lived under the watch of heaven, and when they failed, the empire would remind them with rebellion and ruin. Religion and philosophy softened the edges of this harsh reality. Confucianism gave structure. Taoism offered retreat. Buddhism promised escape. Together with folk rituals and ancestor worship, They formed a spiritual world that could comfort the weary, guide the lost, and bind communities together. A peasant lighting incense at an altar, a scholar reciting the classics, a monk chanting at dawn, all were participating in the same great search for harmony in a world that so often resisted it. If we compare it to our world today, the distance seems immeasurable. We live with medicine, technology, rights, and freedoms that would have been unimaginable to someone in ancient China. A toothache today is a minor annoyance. Back then, it could be a death sentence. Hunger for us is usually a skipped meal. For them, it was a season of dread. Punishment for crime now is a fine, probation, or prison. Then, it was public humiliation, mutilation, or execution. Where we question authority, they bow to it. Where we celebrate individuality, they sacrifice themselves to family and tradition. And yet, if you look closely, you will see faint echoes of their world and ours. The importance of family, the rituals that shape our holidays, the moral questions about power and responsibility, these are threads that stretch back to those distant centuries. The philosophies of Confucius still influence governments and cultures. Taoist ideas of balance and flow still shape art and medicine. Buddhist compassion continues to inspire millions. The voices of ancient China are not silent. They still whisper in the background of our lives. To ask whether you would survive in ancient China is to confront the truth of your own fragility. Most of us, accustomed to comfort, freedom, and safety, would struggle even to last a single day. The work, the hunger, the fear, the obedience, they would crush us. And yet, millions did survive. Generation after generation, building one of the most enduring civilizations in human history. They survived not because life was easy, but because they adapted, believed, endured, and passed their world on to those who came after. Their resilience is perhaps the greatest lesson. Survival in ancient China was not only about enduring physical hardship, but about accepting one's place in a larger order, about finding meaning in duty, ritual, and faith. Where we might rebel, they submitted. Where we might despair, they found strength in family and tradition. Where we might crumble, they endured. And so the story of ancient China is not only a story of suffering, but of persistence. Against hunger, against tyranny, against the weight of heaven itself, ordinary men and women lived their lives, raised their children, honored their ancestors, and hoped for better days. Their struggles remind us of the fragility of our own world, of how easily comfort can be taken for granted, and of the astonishing capacity of human beings to endure even the harshest of fates. If you close your eyes and place yourself there among the rice fields, in the crowded streets of a walled city, before the ancestral altar in a smoky hut, you will feel it. The weight of survival, the demands of ritual, the silent presence of heaven watching from above. You will understand why to live even a single day in ancient China was to carry a burden heavier than most of us can imagine. And so we return to the question, would you survive? The answer is almost certainly no. Not because you are weak, but because survival then required a different kind of strength, one forged by necessity, by faith, by fear, by hope. The people of ancient China did not choose this life, but they endured it, and in doing so, they left behind a civilization whose influence still reaches us today. Perhaps that is the final lesson, that survival is not measured in comfort, but in endurance. That meaning can be found not only in freedom, but in duty, and that even in the harshest of worlds, humanity finds a way to continue. The people of ancient China may not have asked themselves whether they would survive a single day, but by surviving day after day, year after year, they built something greater than themselves. They built a world that lasted for millennia. To imagine living there is to imagine being tested to your limits. To admire it from afar is to recognize the strength of those who came before us. And to remember it now is to be humbled, reminded that survival has never been easy, and that the comforts we take for granted were purchased by the endurance of countless lives long past. So the answer remains, you would not last a day in ancient China, but they did. And that is why their story still matters.